Parker was only 8 years old, but she already understood more about loneliness than most adults ever would. She lived in a modest two-story house on the edge of a small town in the United States, where neighbors knew one another by name and strangers rarely passed through. To the world, seemed like an ordinary child with soft brown curls, wide hazel eyes, and a quiet disposition that often made people call her shy. Yet those who knew her well, or more accurately, those who knew her dog, saw that silence was not emptiness but depth. Her constant companion was Max, a golden retriever with a honey-colored coat and eyes that seemed almost human in their understanding. He had been a gift from her grandfather on her 5th birthday, though gift hardly captured the role Max would come to play in life. At first he was just a puppy, clumsy and playful, tumbling over his oversized paws. But as the years passed, he became something more than a pet. He was protector, confidant, and family rolled into one. Every morning before the sun rose, padded down the wooden staircase in her pajamas to find Max waiting by the back door. His tail wagged furiously, his body practically vibrating with excitement as though he had been waiting all night just to see her face again. Together they would slip into the cool morning air, dew clinging to the grass, and wander through the small garden her mother once tended. Would whisper her dreams from the night before, telling Max about the strange worlds her imagination had built. He listened without judgment, his ears flicking in rhythm to her voice. Though had friends at school, none of them understood her like Max did. People her age didn't always notice when she was upset, but Max never missed a beat. On days when she came home with slumped shoulders and teary eyes, Max would pad silently beside her, pressing his warm body close until she felt steady again. He had a way of noticing the tiny details, the nervous wringing of her hands, the tremor in her breathing, and responding with a quiet comfort no human could replicate. Their bond was sealed through a secret gesture, a language invented between them. It started one night when parents were arguing downstairs, their voices sharp and frightening. She had sat on her bed, hugging her knees, feeling the weight of fear pressing on her chest. Max had climbed up beside her, placing his head on her lap, on instinct pressed her small hand over her heart and whispered, "Stay with me." From then on, that gesture became their code. Whenever touched her heart, Max came closer, no matter where he was. It was a silent promise, "I am here, you are not alone." This simple ritual grew into something sacred between them. In the quiet hours before bedtime, often practiced the gesture, smiling when Max immediately perked up. At school, she sometimes tapped her chest under her desk, imagining Max was beside her, and it gave her courage to raise her hand in class or speak to another child. It was as though their silent language extended beyond distance, tethering them with an invisible thread of trust. To the outside world and Max were inseparable. Neighbors often commented on how unusual it was to see a child and dog so attuned. On summer afternoons, when other children rode bikes or played tag and Max wandered into the woods behind her house, they read stories aloud while Max sprawled lazily beside her, paws stretched, tongue lolling. Sometimes she made up her own tales, weaving him in as a knight or a hero who saved kingdoms with loyalty instead of swords. Too, these weren't just games. They were reflections of the truth she felt in her heart. Max really was her hero. The bond between them deepened further one afternoon at the local park. Had been balancing on the edge of a low stone wall when she lost her footing and fell. It wasn't a serious fall, only a scraped knee, but the sight of her blood sent her into a panic. Before she could cry out, Max was there, licking her hand and whining softly as though urging her to stay calm. The pain faded in the warmth of his presence, and she managed a small smile. "You're my best friend, Max," she whispered through tears. His tail thumped in agreement. In many ways, Max filled the gaps her parents left behind. They loved, but their own struggles often overshadowed her needs. Her father worked long hours, coming home tired and short-tempered, while her mother seemed weighed down by worries she rarely spoke aloud. Arguments flared often, leaving to retreat into her room. But Max was always there, steady and unchanging, ready to absorb her sadness without demanding explanations. It was during one of these arguments that realized just how powerful her bond with Max truly was. Her parents' voices grew so loud that she feared the walls might crack under the tension. She sat trembling at the top of the stairs, tears sliding down her cheeks. Max nudged her with his nose, and she instinctively pressed her hand to her heart. Immediately, he sat firmly at her side, shoulders squared, gaze sharp as though daring anyone to come near her. In that moment felt stronger, braver, and she understood something important. Max wasn't just comforting her, he was protecting her. This understanding followed her into every part of her life. When she walked to school, Max trotted proudly beside her, drawing smiles from. When she sat in her room drawing pictures, Max rested his head on her foot, anchoring her in quiet companionship. Even at night, when nightmares woke her, all it took was one glance toward the sleeping dog curled at the foot of her bed, and she felt safe again. One rainy Saturday decided to test just how deep their connection ran. She stood in the living room, Max across the room by the window. Without a word, she placed her hand over her heart. Immediately, Max turned, his ears lifting as he padded over to her. His reaction was so immediate, so sure, that laughed through the raindrops streaking the glass. "See, you really do understand me," she said. And in Max's wagging tail and steady eyes, she felt the affirmation of something larger than herself, a bond that no one could explain but everyone could see. The small town soon came to know and Max as a pair. At the grocery store, locals smiled when walked in holding Max's leash, his golden coat shining under fluorescent lights. At school events, teachers allowed Max to sit quietly at her feet, noting how his presence helped her participate with newfound confidence. Even the stern librarian made an exception, permitting Max to lie under the reading table while devoured books. It was as if the world itself recognized that this bond was something special, something worth honoring. What no one knew then, not even, was just how important this connection would become. For now, it was enough that she had her best friend by her side, her secret gesture, and the comfort of knowing that whenever life felt too heavy, she could call Max with nothing more than a hand pressed gently over her heart. In size, Max wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a silent witness to her childhood and the keeper of her courage. And though the future held storms neither of them could foresee, one truth was already clear: together they could face anything. For as long as could remember, her house had carried two very different moods. On good days, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, filling the room with warmth as her mother hummed while making pancakes. Her father would smile at the sight of syrup-smeared grin, and for a fleeting moment, life felt almost normal. But on bad days, which came more often as the years passed, the house turned into a battlefield. The kitchen walls seemed to trap every shouted word, every slammed door, until longed to escape into the quiet sanctuary of her room, with Max faithfully at her heels. Her parents' marriage had been crumbling for years, though was too young to remember when the first cracks appeared. What she knew was that love, once visible in small gestures, had hardened into cold exchanges. Her father, Daniel Parker, was a man of discipline, his life ruled by schedules and routines. He worked long hours at a financial firm, returning home each evening with furrowed brows and tired eyes. Her mother, Rachel, had once been a vibrant woman with a laugh that filled rooms, but the weight of constant arguments had drained that brightness. At first, thought all families argued. She overheard her friends at school mention their parents fighting too, and she figured it was just part of life. But as she grew older, she began to realize that her home wasn't like others. While her friends went on family trips or had parents cheering together at soccer games, often saw her parents sitting on opposite sides of the bleachers, barely acknowledging each other. She learned to measure the temperature of the house the moment she walked in. Was her mother's jaw tight? Did her father's voice sound clipped? These were signs of the storm to come. Max became her barometer for those storms. He sensed tension before the first harsh words were spoken. When her parents' tones began to rise, he would nudge toward her room as though guiding her away from the fire. Often obeyed, retreating upstairs where she pressed her palms to her ears, trying to drown out the sound. She hated the words most of all, words like divorce, custody, court. They felt heavy, sharp, and too big for a little girl to carry. The breaking point came one winter evening, just after his 8th birthday. The snow outside glittered beneath the streetlights, but inside the Parker home, tempers flared hotter than ever. Daniel and Rachel argued over who should have for the holidays. Their voices carried through the walls, slicing the air with accusations. "She needs stability," her father said sharply. "You coddle her too much. She needs structure, Rachel." "And she needs love, Daniel," her mother fired back. "Not rules and charts. She's a child, not a soldier in your office." Sat at the top of the stairs, clutching Max's fur, her stomach twisting. She didn't understand why love had turned into a tug-of-war with her at the center. Her father wanted more control, her mother wanted more time and wanted only peace. She buried her face into Max's coat, tears spilling silently as the voices below grew louder. Soon after that night, papers appeared on the kitchen counter, stacks of documents filled with words couldn't read but instinctively feared. Lawyers began visiting, speaking in low tones to her parents. She overheard snippets: joint custody, visitation rights, court date. The word court became especially haunting, though she wasn't entirely sure what it meant. She only knew that it carried the power to change her life. Max felt her unease. He never left her side, padding after her from room to room. At night, when lay awake listening to the hum of distant arguments, she pressed her hand over her heart, summoning him closer. His steady presence was the only anchor keeping her from drifting into fear. The day her parents explained the custody battle, sat at the dining table, legs swinging nervously above the floor. Daniel sat stiffly across from her, while Rachel wrung her hands, eyes glossy. "Sweetheart," her mother began softly, "things are going to change a little. Daddy and I, we can't live together anymore." His chest tightened. She looked at her father, hoping for a denial, but he only nodded, expression unreadable. You'll spend time with both of us, Rachel continued, her voice trembling. We love you very much. This isn't your fault. Swallowed hard, clutching Max's ear. Do I have to choose? She whispered. The silence that followed was answer enough. In the weeks that followed, preparations for court consumed the household. Rachel whispered urgently into the phone late at night. Daniel disappeared into his office, emerging with stacks of papers. They each began to look at differently, not just as their daughter, but as evidence. Who could provide the better home? Who could prove themselves more deserving? Felt the shift keenly. Every gesture seemed scrutinized. If she laughed more with her mother, her father grew colder. If she followed her father's strict bedtime, her mother sighed with frustration. She was caught in the middle of a war she never wanted to fight. School became an escape, though even there, whispers followed her. Teachers spoke in hushed voices, and friends asked too many questions. Are your parents getting divorced? One girl asked bluntly on the playground, turned away, cheeks burning, wishing she could vanish. Only Max understood her silence, trotting beside her with steady loyalty. When the court date was announced, Rachel explained that might have to speak in front of a judge. The thought made stomach twist into knots. She imagined a tall, stern man in a black robe demanding she choose between her parents. At night, she cried into Max's fur, whispering, I don't want to pick, I just want us to be happy again. Max licked her cheek gently, his presence a balm against the impossible choice ahead. The morning of the first court hearing arrived gray and cold. Wore her best dress, chosen by her mother, and sat in the backseat of the car with Max curled at her feet. The courthouse loomed large and intimidating, its stone walls cold against the sky. Inside, the air smelled of polish and paper. Men and women in suits bustled about, carrying files and speaking quickly, clutched Max's leash tightly, her small hand trembling. Her parents walked ahead, their faces set, their shoulders squared as if they were soldiers entering battle. Lagged behind, her heart pounding. She had never felt smaller. The courtroom itself was overwhelming, high ceilings, heavy wooden benches, and a judge's bench that seemed impossibly far away. Sat with her mother on one side, her father across the aisle. Max lay beneath her chair, head resting on his paws, eyes alert. His steady breathing was the only thing that kept her from breaking down entirely. The lawyers spoke first, their voices filling the room with words barely understood. They argued about schedules, stability, finances, details that felt meaningless to a child who only wanted peace. Gaze drifted to Max, who looked back at her with calm certainty. She pressed her hand over her heart, and true to their promise, Max shifted closer, pressing against her leg. It was then that the judge glanced at, his expression unreadable. We may need to hear from the child herself, he said. The words made her blood run cold. Her throat tightened, her palms damp with sweat. She leaned down, whispering into Max's ear, Don't leave me. His tail thumped softly in reply. In that moment, realized the custody battle wasn't just about her parents anymore. It was about her. And whether or not she could find her voice in that intimidating courtroom, one thing was certain, she would not face it alone. Max was there, steady as ever, ready to stand beside her in whatever storm lay ahead. The winter nights in his house grew longer, darker, and colder, not because of the season, but because of the silences that followed her parents' arguments. Once the shouting was over, once the lawyers had gone home, there remained an emptiness, a heavy hush that made even the walls seem to hold their breath. Had learned to read silence the way others read books. She could tell the difference between the silence of anger when her father disappeared into his office and slammed the door, and the silence of sadness when her mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of tea. But there was one silence she loved more than any other, the quiet she shared with Max. In their silence there was no judgment, no fear, just understanding. Max had always been intuitive, but in the months leading up to the custody hearings, his attentiveness became uncanny. He seemed to notice every flicker of emotions, the way her shoulders hunched when she was nervous, the way her fingers fidgeted when she was anxious, the way her eyes darted toward the door when she feared another argument was about to erupt, and he always responded the same way, with presence. He didn't bark or demand attention, he simply stayed with her, steady as a lighthouse guiding a ship through stormy waters. It was during one of those stormy nights that their secret signal was truly born. Had been lying in bed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as the muffled sound of her parents' argument echoed from downstairs. She hugged her pillow tightly, trying not to hear the words she didn't understand. Custody, visitation, rights. She hated those words. They felt too sharp for her small heart to hold. Max jumped onto her bed, curling beside her. She stroked his ears, whispering, "Don't leave me, Max." On impulse, she pressed her hand to her heart and looked at him. He immediately perked up, his gaze sharpening as if he understood exactly what she meant. He pushed his nose into her hand, then rested his head on her chest, his heartbeat syncing with hers. From that night on, the gesture became their unspoken language. Whenever felt overwhelmed, she pressed her palm to her heart. Without fail, Max would respond. If he was across the room, he would cross it immediately, nudging her hand or leaning into her side. If he was already beside her, he would adjust his position, pressing closer as though to say, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." At first, thought it was just coincidence. Dogs were loyal after all, and Max had always been attentive. But the more she tested it, the more she realized this was something deeper. One afternoon, she stood in the backyard while Max sniffed at the far end of the fence. She placed her hand over her heart without saying a word. Immediately, Max stopped what he was doing, turned, and trotted straight to her, wagging his tail as if answering a call. Her eyes widened in wonder. "You really do understand me," she whispered, hugging his neck. It became their secret. At school, when felt nervous about speaking up in class, she sometimes touched her heart under the desk, imagining Max beside her. The thought calmed her, gave her courage to lift her hand and answer questions. When bullies teased her on the playground, she tapped her chest and thought of Max's steady eyes, and suddenly the sting of their words didn't feel so unbearable. Her teachers noticed the change. "She's becoming more confident," one remarked to her mother during a parent-teacher meeting. But Rachel only smiled sadly, knowing the truth, that newfound strength came not from her parents, but from her dog. The signal grew stronger as the court dates drew nearer. Dreaded the hearings, dreaded the idea of standing in a room full of adults, all waiting for her to speak. She wasn't sure what they expected her to say. Should she declare her love for her mother, her father? Should she pick sides like they wanted her to? The weight of it was too much for her small shoulders to carry. One evening, as she sat on the porch steps with Max, she whispered her fears aloud. "What if I can't talk? What if I freeze? What if they don't believe me?" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hand to her heart. Max, as always, leaned closer, pressing his nose against her chest. That moment gave her an idea. "What if I don't have to talk?" she whispered. "What if you can help me if I do this?" She pressed her hand harder against her heart. "Then you'll know, you'll come, you'll give me courage." Max's tail wagged, slow and steady, as though he understood the plan. In the weeks leading up to the big day, practiced. Each time she felt afraid, whether it was at school, at the grocery store, or even lying awake in bed, she touched her heart. Each time Max responded, reminding her of their promise. And slowly her fear began to change. It didn't disappear, but it softened, replaced by a fragile kind of hope. Her mother noticed the bond too. "That dog," Rachel whispered one night, watching asleep with Max curled protectively beside her. "He's the only thing keeping her whole." Even Daniel, who often dismissed emotions as weakness, seemed to recognize it. Though he never said it aloud, he allowed Max to accompany to the hearings, something he might once have refused. Deep down, even he couldn't deny the comfort Max brought their daughter. The night before the most important court session, lay awake staring at the ceiling. Max was sprawled across her feet, snoring softly. She reached down to stroke his fur. "Tomorrow's the big day, Max," she whispered. "They're going to ask me questions, and I don't know if I can do it." Her throat tightened, tears welling. "But if I do this," she pressed her hand over her heart, "you'll come, right? You'll help me be brave." Max lifted his head sleepily, as though answering her unspoken question. His tail thumped against the blanket, and he leaned into her hand. Closed her eyes, clutching the promise. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. No matter how frightening the courtroom felt, she wouldn't be facing it alone. She had her silent understanding with Max, a language no one else could break. And in that knowledge, for the first time in weeks, she finally drifted into peaceful sleep. The courthouse loomed like a castle carved from stone, its tall gray walls stretching into the winter sky. To most adults, it was a place of order, of rules and justice. But to 8-year-old Parker, it felt more like a giant swallowing her whole. She clutched Max's leash tightly in her small hand, her knuckles pale against the leather strap. Her other hand gripped the hem of her dress, twisting the fabric nervously. Rachel walked briskly beside her, heels clicking against the marble steps, while Daniel trailed just a few paces behind. Neither parent spoke. Their silence was thick, heavy with the weight of old arguments and unspoken accusations. Walked between them, feeling small and invisible, as if she were just another piece of evidence being carried into the courtroom. The lobby buzzed with people in suits, carrying folders and speaking in clipped tones. Everything felt too big, the ceilings, the echo of footsteps, the stern security guards, pressed closer to Max, who trotted at her side, his tail low but wagging slowly as if to reassure her. She looked down into his steady eyes, whispering, "It's okay, you're here." Max licked her fingers, and for a moment the panic in her chest loosened. Inside the courtroom, the world changed again. The room was vast, lined with wooden benches that reminded of church pews. At the far end, a judge's bench rose high above everyone else, like a throne. The judge himself sat tall, black robe pooling around him, spectacles perched on his nose. He glanced down at the papers before him, then over at the people filing into the room. His gaze was not unkind, but it was distant, like someone observing pieces on a chessboard. And her mother sat at one table, Daniel at another, each flanked by lawyers. The sight of her parents on opposite sides cuts heart in two. She wanted to run across the room, grab their hands, and glue them back together, but she knew it wasn't that simple anymore. Max curled under his chair, resting his head on his paws. The judge noticed him and gave a small nod. "I see the child has a comfort animal," he remarked. The lawyers muttered agreements and no one objected, felt relief wash over her. At least Max was allowed to stay. Then the voices began. The lawyers argued back and forth, their words sharp, precise, and alien. Terms like joint custody, stability, financial support, visitation rights floated through the air like clouds couldn't catch. She tried to follow, but it was like listening to a foreign language. All she understood was that they were talking about her, dissecting her life as though it were a puzzle to be solved. At one point, one lawyer gestured toward her. "Your Honor, the child herself may provide the clearest insight." The judge glanced at, she froze under his gaze, her stomach twisting. He nodded thoughtfully. "We will hear from the child." The words echoed inside's mind, hear from the child. That meant her, she was the child. And suddenly the walls of the courtroom felt closer, the air heavier. Her mother squeezed her shoulder. "You'll be fine, sweetheart," Rachel whispered, though her own voice trembled. Her father across the room adjusted his tie and gave a tight nod. For once they seemed united in their expectation. They both wanted her to speak. But didn't feel fine. She felt like a tiny boat tossed into a storm. The bailiff led her to the witness chair, a tall wooden seat that made her legs dangle in the air. She climbed up awkwardly, Max shifting beneath her chair, his eyes tracking her every move. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Parker, can you tell us what you saw and how you feel about the current situation?" His voice was calm, but it carried weight. His throat closed. Dozens of eyes were on her, the jury, the judge, her parents, strangers she didn't know. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her tongue felt glued to the roof of her mouth, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The lawyer repeated the question more gently. "Can you share with us where you feel most safe?" Her hands trembled on the armrest. She wanted to answer. She wanted to tell them about the fights, about the nights she cried into Max's fur, about the way she hated being caught in the middle. But when she looked at her father's stern face and her mother's pleading eyes, fear gripped her. What if she chose wrong? What if she hurt one of them? The silence grew heavy. The judge adjusted his glasses. People leaned forward. Palms grew slick with sweat. She glanced down at Max. His calm golden eyes stared back at her, steady and sure. She wanted to reach for him, but the rules of the court made her hesitate. She felt trapped, her voice locked away, fear pressing on her chest like a stone. Her vision blurred with tears. The lawyer tried again. "It's okay. You can just tell us how you feel." But couldn't. Her lips parted, then closed. The silence stretched longer. Whispers began in the back of the room. The judge sighed. "If the child is unable to." Her world tilted. The pressure was unbearable. Everyone expected something from her, but she had nothing to give. That was when instinct took over. Her small hand rose shakily, pressing against her chest, right over her heart. It wasn't planned. It wasn't deliberate. It was the same gesture she had made countless times before, in the safety of her bedroom, in the quiet of the woods, in moments when fear had threatened to swallow her. It was the only language she knew when words failed. The room held its breath. Max lifted his head instantly, ears pricking at the familiar signal. Without hesitation, he rose, padded to her side, and pressed his body against her leg. The movement drew gasps from the courtroom. The dog hadn't barked, hadn't made a sound. He had simply responded, as though he understood her silent plea better than anyone else in the room. His hand lingered on her heart, her fingers trembling. Tears slid down her cheeks, but this time they weren't only from fear, they were from relief. Max was there, he had answered. The judge leaned back, his expression shifting. The jury murmured softly, captivated by what they had just witnessed. For the first time since entering the courtroom, felt the heavy air begin to lift. She bent her head close to Max, whispering through shaky breaths, "Thank you." His tail thumped once, steady, reassuring. The silence that had suffocated her moments before was now different. It wasn't the silence of pressure or judgment. It was the silence of awe, the hush that falls when something extraordinary has just happened. Hadn't spoken a word, yet somehow, with one simple gesture and one loyal dog, she had said everything she needed to. And though she didn't know it yet, that small act would change the course of the trial and her life forever. The courtroom had gone still after pressed her hand against her chest. For a few tense moments, no one moved, no one spoke. The air seemed suspended, like the pause between the drawing of a bowstring and the release of an arrow. Then Max moved. From his spot beneath the witness chair, his ears pricked forward, his body rising with a quiet grace that contrasted the tension in the room. He stepped out from under the table, tail swaying slowly, and pressed himself against legs. She gasped softly at the familiar weight. His nose nudged her trembling hand, and with that one small gesture, the spell of fear shattered. A ripple moved through the courtroom, gasps, murmurs, whispers. A bailiff started forward as though unsure if the dog's movement broke some sacred rule of order, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. His sharp eyes were locked on the child and her golden retriever, curiosity overtaking his stern demeanor. Let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down into Max's steady eyes, and for the first time since she had been called to the stand, her heartbeat slowed. Her fear loosened its grip, not gone, but softened by the warmth pressing against her. She touched his head, fingers tangling in his fur, and whispered, barely audible, "You came." It was such a small thing, a girl, a dog, and a gesture no one else truly understood. Yet, too, it was everything, and to the courtroom it was something they had never seen before. The judge leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses. His voice, usually measured and distant, carried a trace of wonder. "Young lady," he said softly, "was that a signal?" Froze, she hadn't meant for anyone else to notice. The gesture was hers and Max's secret, their private language. She didn't know if she should explain or if explaining would take away its magic. She glanced at Max, who stood patient and calm, tail swishing lightly against the polished wooden floor. He seemed to tell her it was okay. She swallowed and nodded. It's how I ask him to stay with me," she whispered, her voice small but clear. The courtroom murmured again, but this time with softer tones. The judge raised a hand and silence returned. He regarded her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "I see." The lawyer who had asked her the original question stepped forward again, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. His tone was gentler now, less clinical. "Can you tell us what Max did when you made that gesture?" Hesitated, glancing at Max. "He came. He always comes. It means I need him." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her fingers harder against Max's fur as if to ground herself. "And he never lets me down." The lawyer paused, visibly moved. He nodded. "Thank you." For a brief moment, the heavy seriousness of the courtroom cracked open to reveal something softer. Even the jury leaned forward, their faces no longer stone but touched with empathy. The judge scribbled something in his notes, though his gaze lingered on the girl and her dog longer than usual. Daniel Parker, sitting rigid at his table, shifted uncomfortably. He had always valued order, logic, and rules, but watching his daughter, his little girl, find courage not through arguments or facts but through her dog unsettled him. Rachel, on the other hand, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. She had always known the bond between and Max was extraordinary, but seeing it laid bare in front of strangers made her heart ache with pride and sorrow all at once. The lawyer cleared his throat. "When you made that gesture, did Max help you feel safe?" Nodded, clutching Max's ear gently. "He makes me feel like I can talk, like I don't have to be scared anymore." The words were simple, childlike, but in their simplicity lay a power that no legal argument could match. The courtroom, for all its formality and structure, was reminded of something pure: trust. The judge, who had seen countless testimonies in his years on the bench, shifted in his seat. Rarely did he allow emotion to sway him, but something about this child and her dog touched a place deep inside him. He glanced at the attorneys, who were momentarily silent. Perhaps they, too, recognized that they were no longer just debating custody, they were witnessing something far greater. Pressed her hand to her heart again, testing. Instantly Max nudged her side, and the courtroom watched in awe. This time she smiled, a fragile but genuine curve of her lips. "See," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for the jury to hear. "He always knows." That smile broke through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. For weeks had been caught between two worlds, her mother's sadness, her father's rigidity, the endless tug-of-war over her future. Yet in that moment she wasn't a piece of evidence or a pawn in a legal battle. She was simply a little girl with her best friend, showing the world a love that needed no words. The lawyer stepped back, glancing at the judge as if to say, "I have no further questions." The judge nodded slowly, though his gaze remained thoughtful. Leaned closer to Max, whispering only for him, "I can do this. With you I can." For the remainder of her testimony, she spoke haltingly, but with more strength than anyone expected. Each time her voice faltered, her hand brushed her heart, and Max responded without fail. The rhythm of their unspoken language gave her the courage to keep going. She described how she felt when her parents argued, how the house no longer felt like home, how she often cried into Max's fur at night. She didn't say which parent she wanted to live with because she didn't want to choose, but she did say one thing with absolute certainty: "I feel safe when Max is with me." The weight of her words hung in the air, undeniable. By the time she finished, the courtroom had changed. The stern faces of the jury were softer, the tension in the air lighter. Even the judge seemed less like a distant figure and more like a man seeing truth through a child's eyes. And though the custody battle was far from over, everyone in that room understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not a legal maneuver, not a brilliant argument, but the power of a simple gesture between a child and her dog. It was more than communication, it was trust made visible. A step down from the witness chair, Max at her side, the room was quiet, not with pressure this time, but with reverence. Heads turned as she walked back to her seat, her small hand gripping Max's leash. She didn't look at her parents, didn't look at the jury. She kept her gaze fixed on Max, her anchor in the storm. And for the first time since the custody battle had begun, felt something close to hope. The courtroom had always been a place of order, strict rules, solemn words, and cold procedures. But in that single moment when Max responded to his hand-over-heart gesture, everything shifted. The room no longer felt like a rigid stage for arguments and evidence. It felt human, alive. The jury sat forward in their seats, their attention fully captured. These were men and women who had endured countless hours of testimony in countless cases, but rarely had they seen anything so disarmingly genuine. Their eyes followed the golden retriever as he pressed himself into the trembling child's side, tail sweeping softly against the floor. His hand trembled as it rested on Max's fur, but her eyes, once clouded with fear, began to clear. The simple presence of her dog gave her something that no lawyer, no parent, no judge had been able to provide in weeks: courage. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. He studied the pair carefully, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he were suppressing an emotion. Years of judicial experience had trained him to remain impartial, yet even he was not immune to the quiet force of what had just unfolded. Rachel, sitting at the petitioner's table, pressed her hand over her lips. Tears welled in her eyes, glistening like morning dew. She had fought so hard for this case, endured sleepless nights, but nothing she or her lawyer had said carried as much weight as the image of her daughter finding strength through her dog. She wanted to leap up, to scoop into her arms, but she remained still, knowing she had to let this moment speak for itself. Across the room, Daniel shifted in his seat, discomfort etched across his features. He was a man of logic and discipline, a man who believed in clear rules and clear lines. Yet here was his daughter, communicating without words, showing a truth he could neither refute nor control. He folded his arms, trying to appear unmoved, but his jaw tightened and his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The lawyer who had questioned paused, sensing the fragile shift in the room. He cleared his throat and asked softly, "When Max came to you just now, what did it make you feel?" Looked down at Max, her fingers tightening around his collar. She swallowed, then whispered, "Like I wasn't alone." The words struck the jury like a bell, simple, honest, undeniable. The lawyer nodded gently. "And is that important to you, to not feel alone?" His eyes shimmered with tears, but her voice carried more strength this time. "Yes, because when I'm alone, I'm scared, but when Max is with me, I feel brave." A hush swept the room again. The judge scribbled something in his notes, though his gaze lingered on the child longer than the paper. The jury exchanged glances, many of them visibly moved. Even one of the bailiffs, usually a statue of neutrality, shifted uncomfortably as if fighting the sting of tears. Bent her head close to Max, whispering something only he could hear. His ears flicked, and he responded by nuzzling her cheek. The gesture was small, tender, but powerful. The jury leaned forward instinctively, as though trying not to miss a single detail. The lawyer gave her a moment, then asked, "Would you like to share what you said to Max just now?" She hesitated, biting her lip. Finally, she nodded. "I told him thank you because he helps me say what I can't say on my own." Rachel stifled a sob while Daniel's stern mask cracked slightly, his eyes flickering with something unspoken, guilt, perhaps, or recognition. The judge leaned forward. "You're doing very well," he said in a softer tone than anyone had yet heard from him. "You don't need to be afraid here." The child nodded, her small shoulders squaring. She brushed her hand over her heart again, and once more Max leaned into her, ready. The room collectively held its breath as though witnessing a sacred ritual. This silent exchange between a girl and her dog carried more weight than any legal argument, more truth than any sworn testimony. The lawyer gestured lightly. "Could you tell us what Max means to you?" She thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she answered slowly, her words deliberate as though each one carried part of her soul. Max is like my voice. When I'm too scared to talk, he talks for me. Not with words, but with the way he stays. He's the only one who never leaves." Her words silenced the room again. Even the court reporter, who was typing furiously, blinked back emotion as she recorded the testimony. For the first time since the trial began, did not look fragile. She looked strong, still small, still vulnerable, but strong in the way a flame is strong when it refuses to go out, no matter how fierce the wind. The judge finally spoke again, his voice firm but kind. "Thank you, that was very brave." She gave a small nod, her hand never leaving Max's head. As she stepped down from the witness chair, Max trotting beside her, the jury's eyes followed her. They weren't watching a child torn between two parents anymore. They were watching a child who had just revealed the depth of her bond with her dog, a bond that had allowed her to face fears far beyond her years. Rachel reached for her as she returned to their table, pulling her gently into her side. She whispered, "You were amazing, sweetheart," nodded but kept her eyes on Max, who settled at her feet like a sentinel. Daniel sat stiffly, but for the first time his gaze softened as he watched his daughter. He didn't speak, didn't move, but in the silence between them lingered the unspoken truth. He had just witnessed something he could neither control nor ignore. The courtroom gradually resumed its rhythm, lawyers whispering, the judge making notes, the bailiff shifting his weight, but something fundamental had changed. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with sterile procedure. It was infused with something raw, something deeply human. Everyone present knew they had seen more than just testimony. They had seen love made visible, trust displayed in its form. And though no verdict had yet been reached, the jury's faces told the story. They would not forget what they had just witnessed. With one simple gesture and Max's unwavering response had turned the tide of the case. For the rest of the day, no matter what arguments were presented, no one could shake the image of the small girl pressing her hand to her heart and the golden retriever rising instantly, faithfully, to her side. That image would linger long after the gavel struck. The courtroom had grown used to silence after simple gesture and Max's loyal response. It wasn't the tense silence from earlier, the kind that pressed down like a heavy blanket. This was different. It was reverent, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sat back down at the petitioner's table, Max curling at her feet like a golden shadow. She stroked his fur, her small fingers tracing the same path again and again, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm. Her mother whispered encouragement, but barely heard. All she could focus on was the warmth at her feet and the thrum of her own heartbeat, which no longer raced like it had before. The judge cleared his throat. "The child may continue." His tone was calm, almost gentle, so unlike the booming authority he normally carried. Lifted her chin, she was still scared. How could she not be? The room was full of adults staring at her, waiting, judging. But now, with Max by her side, she felt a little flame flicker inside her chest. It wasn't bright, not yet, but it was steady. The lawyer approached again, kneeling slightly so he didn't tower over her. He began softly, "You've shown us how much Max means to you, but can you tell us more about what life has been like for you at home?" Froze, her fingers tightened on Max's collar. Her eyes darted toward her parents, their faces so familiar yet so full of conflict. Rachel's gaze brimmed with tears, silently pleading with her to speak. Daniel sat, his jaw rigid, his expression unreadable. The words sat heavy in her chest. To speak them felt like betrayal. To stay silent felt like suffocating. Her hand drifted to her heart again, almost without thought. Max's ears flicked, and he lifted his head, pressing his nose into her knee. She felt his breath, warm and steady, and something in her loosened. Looked back at the lawyer. Sometimes her voice cracked and she swallowed. Sometimes it's loud at home, too loud. The lawyer's expression softened. Loud how? She took a deep breath, her small shoulders trembling. Mom and Dad fight all the time. They shout at each other and they don't stop. And when they do stop, they don't talk at all. It's like the whole house goes quiet, but not the nice kind of quiet. It's the kind where you feel like you're invisible. Her words spilled out in fits and starts, halting but honest. The courtroom leaned in, hanging on every syllable. Glanced at her father, then back at Max. "Sometimes I hide in my room. I close the door and I tell Max to stay with me," she demonstrated by pressing her hand to her chest. Max nudged her side on cue and she smiled faintly through her tears. "And he does, he always does." Her voice grew stronger, as though the simple act of speaking had broken a dam inside her. "I tell him everything, how I hate when they make me choose, how I wish we could all sit together like before when we laughed at dinner or went to the park. But now I don't know where I belong. I just know I don't feel safe when they're yelling. I only feel safe when Max is with me." The jury shifted, several members visibly moved. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue, while a man at the end of the row clenched his jaw, his expression tight with empathy. Daniel's face remained composed, but a crack ran through his mask. He leaned back slightly, eyes glistening with something he rarely allowed himself to feel in public: regret. The lawyer paused, giving space. Then he asked carefully, "Is there something you'd like the judge and jury to understand about you, about what you need?" Hesitated, her lip trembling. She pressed her hand over her heart again, drawing strength from Max's steady presence. The dog leaned into her leg, grounding her. She took a deep breath and said, clear and simple, "I need peace. I need a place where I can breathe. I don't want to choose between mom and dad. I just want to feel safe. And the only way I feel safe right now is with Max." The words, though spoken by a child, carried the weight of truth. The courtroom fell into stunned silence once more, but this time the silence was thick with understanding, with the recognition that something pure and unfiltered had just been laid before them. The judge shifted in his seat, his stern exterior softened by what he had heard. He scribbled in his notes but paused often, his eyes lingering on. He had presided over many custody cases, seen endless battles of parents clawing at each other for control, but rarely, if ever, had he seen the voice of a child break through the noise with such clarity. Rachel's tears streamed freely now. She reached for his hand, holding it tightly, but careful not to disturb the bond between her daughter and Max. Daniel, meanwhile, looked down at the table, his composure unraveling. For the first time, he seemed to truly grasp the effect their fighting had on his daughter. The lawyer stepped back, his voice quiet but firm. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. He cleared his throat, then addressed directly, "You have been very brave today, young lady. I want you to know that your voice has been heard." Lowered her gaze, cheeks flushed, but a small smile tugged at her lips. She hadn't wanted to speak. She had been terrified, but she had done it with Max. As she stepped down from the witness chair, Max pressed against her side, steady and sure. The jury's eyes followed her, their expressions softened, changed. They hadn't just seen a child caught between two parents. They had seen her truth, raw and undeniable. Back at the table, Rachel pulled her into a tight embrace, buried her face in her mother's shoulder for a moment, then turned to press her forehead against Max's. "We did it," she whispered. His tail thumped softly in reply. And though the gavel had not yet fallen, though the verdict had not yet been given, everyone in that courtroom knew the tide had turned. The truth was no longer buried beneath arguments and paperwork. It had been spoken in a child's halting words, and it could not be ignored. With Max at her side had changed everything. The courtroom had never been so silent. Even the faintest shuffle of a foot or the whisper of a paper seemed against the charged atmosphere. Sat at her mother's side, Max curled at her feet like a golden anchor. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the steady thrum of her heartbeat, and drew comfort from the rhythm of Max's breathing. The judge rose slowly, his robe swishing softly across the polished floor. His expression was calm but heavy with the weight of responsibility. "We have heard the testimony of the child," he began, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room, "and we have considered the statements of both parents and their representatives." Stomach tightened. This was it, the moment she had feared, the moment she had prepared for in her bedroom, whispered to Max over and over again. She felt his presence at her side, felt the familiar warmth, and suddenly her fear became smaller, almost manageable. The judge continued, his eyes scanning the room, finally resting briefly on Daniel. Custody decisions are never easy. They require weighing the interests of the child above all else, considering both parental capability and the child's well-being. But beyond schedules, beyond visitation and support, there is one truth that cannot be ignored. The safety and emotional health of the child must be paramount. Squeezed Max's collar, her pulse steadying. She didn't know if the judge was about to rule in her favor, but she knew he had heard her truth. "Having observed the child," the judge said, "it is clear that she has a profound bond with her animal companion Max. This bond is more than companionship. It provides emotional stability, comfort, and courage. It has been instrumental in allowing the child to express herself during this proceeding." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Several jurors exchanged glances, their expressions softened by what they had witnessed. Max's role had become undeniable, a silent advocate that words could not replace. The judge paused, taking a deep breath. It is evident that forcing the child into a rigid schedule or compelling her to separate from Max would be detrimental to her well-being. Therefore, the court will ensure that any custody arrangement accommodates the child's emotional needs and the presence of her support animal. Blinked, barely processing the words, her mother gasped softly, tears sliding down her cheeks. Even Daniel's face softened imperceptibly, his lips pressed into a tight line as he seemed to weigh the judge's words carefully. The judge's tone grew firmer. Therefore, the court orders that custody will be shared in a manner that prioritizes the child's safety, emotional stability, and access to her companion animal. Both parents will continue to play important roles in her life, but any decision-making must consider the child's demonstrated needs, including the need for the support provided by Max. His hand gripped Max's fur tightly. Her heart felt like it would burst, not from fear this time, but from relief. Max nudged her fingers gently, as if acknowledging her triumph in his own quiet way. Rachel pulled close, holding her against her side while tears flowed freely. "Oh," she whispered, "you were so brave, so brave." Daniel, still sitting stiffly, leaned back in his chair, his eyes not leaving. There was a silence between father and daughter, a pause filled with recognition. He had not expected to feel the tug of emotion, nor had he anticipated the truth in her simple, silent gestures. Yet here he was, unable to deny that his daughter's bond with Max was undeniable, real, and essential. Outside the courtroom, reporters whispered, but inside there was only a shared sense of awe. The simple gesture that had repeated countless times, the pressing of her hand over her heart, had become the turning point. It had not been words that swayed the court entirely, though her words were heartfelt. It had been the combination of courage and the living proof of loyalty, expressed through a golden retriever who had understood her better than anyone. The lawyers packed their folders, murmuring amongst themselves, but even they could not suppress their smiles. One leaned over to the other and whispered, "I've seen many cases, but rarely one where a support animal played such a pivotal role." Watched as the judge tapped the gavel lightly, the sound echoing like a final punctuation mark in a story that had been years in the making. She pressed her hand over her heart once more, Max leaning into her side, his presence steadying her as always. As the court cleared, people rose quietly, glancing back at the girl who had changed the room without a single show of anger or defiance. They saw a child, small yet infinitely brave, standing with her companion, and they carried the image with them out the doors into the bright winter afternoon. Outside, the sun broke through clouds, illuminating the courthouse steps. Stepped out, Max padding beside her, and for a moment the chaos of legal proceedings fell away. She felt lighter than she had in months, the weight of uncertainty finally lifting. Her mother took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to be okay," Rachel said softly, nodded, still pressed close to Max. "Yes," she whispered, "because Max is with me." Daniel approached slower than usual, his expression unreadable at first, but then he knelt slightly to meet's gaze. I understand now," he said, voice low but sincere. "I've been so caught up in arguing about schedules and control, I forgot the most important thing, your safety and happiness. I see that now." Looked at him, a small smile forming. "You don't have to understand everything," she said, still holding Max's leash. "Just don't forget Max." Daniel chuckled softly, a sound rare in the months leading up to this day. "Never," he promised, and in that moment a fragile truce formed, built not on agreements or legal papers, but on the recognition of what truly mattered, the child and her companion. As they walked down the steps, the world outside felt vast and alive. Children played in the snow, laughter echoing down the street, oblivious to the courtroom drama that had unfolded inside. Pressed her hand against her chest one last time that day, Max nudging her fingers in reply. The gesture had carried her through fear, doubt, and uncertainty, and now it would carry her into a new chapter. Rachel held her close as they reached the family car, leaned forward, scratching Max behind his ears. "Thank you," she whispered, and the dog responded with a soft nuzzle, as if to say, "I'll always be here." Daniel stood nearby, watching. Though the path ahead would require adjustments and cooperation, he now understood that courage had been the catalyst for change. The adults had been forced to see the world through the eyes of the child, a child whose bravery came not from the strength of her voice, but from the unwavering loyalty of her best friend. Later at home, sat on her bed, Max curled at her feet, the afternoon sunlight spilling over the wooden floor. She pressed her hand over her heart again, not out of fear but out of gratitude. She had faced the storm, and together she and Max had emerged stronger. The house, though still imperfect, felt different. The echoes of arguments no longer filled her heart with terror. There was still work to be done, parental compromise, schedules to manage, emotions to navigate, but had discovered something far greater than she could have imagined. The power of trust, love, and the quiet understanding that sometimes words are unnecessary when hearts are in sync. And Max, ever loyal, remained by her side, a golden constant in a world of uncertainty. He had been her voice when she could not speak, her anchor when the currents of fear threatened to sweep her away, and her silent protector in a courtroom that had witnessed her courage. Smiled down at him, pressing her small hand against his soft fur. "We did it," she whispered. Max leaned into her, tail sweeping across the floor. It was a simple response, one they had shared countless times, yet today it carried the weight of victory, of truth, and of love that could not be measured in words. The story, once filled with tension, fear, and uncertainty, had found its resolution not in legal arguments alone, but in the bond between a child and her dog, a bond strong enough to move hearts, change minds, and remind the world that courage often comes in quiet, steadfast forms. And as lay down that night, Max curled at her feet, she pressed her hand to her heart one final time. The gesture had carried her through darkness and uncertainty, and she knew, without a doubt, that as long as Max was there, she could face anything. For in the end, it wasn't just a child and a dog. It was trust, loyalty, and the extraordinary power of love made visible through the simplest of gestures.